So welcome everyone. My name is Gaëtane Vernat and I'm the director of the Power Plant. For 8 years running, Art Toronto has commissioned the Power Plant to co-present Power Talks, a program featuring influential people from the world of art who speak in the context of the fair. This year, the gallery is very pleased to present Tom Eccles, tonight's feature speaker, Chantal Pontbriand, who will speak tomorrow, and Julia Dalt, who will be featured and speak on Sunday afternoon. Many people have helped to make the Power Talks a successful ongoing program. First, the Power Plant would like to thank our partners at Art Toronto, Linnell Ribenchuk, Susanna Rosenstock, and Jenny Biltek. The gallery, in terms of its ongoing program, is indebted to our governmental funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, the Toronto Arts Council, and as always, our partners at Harbourfront Centre. And pleased to note that all public programs at the Power Plant are generously supported by primary educational sponsor, CIBC. The Power Plant is just 5 minutes south of the Convention Centre, located directly on the lakeshore of Harbourfront Centre. We invite you to visit our current exhibition, Micah Lexier, 1 and 2 and More Than 2. And admission at the Power Plant is always free, thanks to our generous sponsorship from BMO Financial. Now I hand things over to my colleague Christine Bowen, Curator of Education and Public Program, who will introduce this evening's fearless speaker, Tom Eccles. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, and thanks again for joining us tonight. Please allow me to introduce you to Tom Eccles, Executive Director of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. Since joining CCS Bard in 2005, he has overseen the construction of the Hessel Museum of Art, which opened in November of 2006, co-curated the inaugural exhibition of the Mary Louise Hessel collection, Russell, among others, and commissioned the permanent installation of Olafur Eliasson's Parliament of Reality on the grounds of Bard. From 2006 until 2010, he was the curatorial advisor to the Park Avenue Armory, and has also served as an advisor to the software developer Adobe for the Adobe Museum of Digital Media. He curated the Sculpture Park for the New York Frieze Art Fair in 2012 and 13, and is a board member of the Keith Haring Foundation. From 1996 until 2005, he was director of the Public Art Fund in New York City, where he curated more than 100 exhibitions and artist projects, including Louise Bourgeois, Janet Cardiff, Mark Dion, Dan Graham, Barbara Kruger, and Pierre Huyghe, among others, and organized a number of outdoor projects in collaboration with New York City institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum, and the New Museum. And this is just a small portion of his many accomplishments. So please join me in welcoming Tom Eccles.
Right, well, thank you, welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure to be in Toronto and hosted by the Power Plant, superb organization, and my first time in Toronto. So, obviously it's an art fair, so it's a talk at an art fair, and I was asked to talk about curating collections, so particularly within an institutional framework. I run a school for curatorial graduates at Bard College in upstate New York. We have about 30 graduates in total over a 2-year period. And we have a collection, the Mary Louise Hessel collection with over 2,000 works that have been collected over the last 50 years, and I'll speak a little bit about that later. I'll give you a little context for the work I have undertaken over the last 15, 20 years. But first, I wanted to, our relationship with collections is always problematic, and so I thought we'd start with how some of us feel every so often about the work we do. It comes from a exhibition organized by the Power Plant's Julia Powerley, who graduated in 2011, and included performance by the artist MPA, included the artist A.K. Burns, and it is called What is Past is Prologue. and includes a work from our collection by Carl Andre. Sorry, that's the wrong bit. Oh well, the best laid plans. So you're probably wondering how we got there. So I'll tell you. So first slide. So my background is I came to New York in the early 90s and was made director of the Public Art Fund in New York, which was a small organization at the time and had a kind of problem in that I didn't really like public art. And I was trying to figure out how how to kind of reshape an organization in many ways, how to think about whatever an organization was. The Public Art Fund is not public, it's not a fund, and it, in my view, didn't do a lot of art at the time. And trying to think through, rather than thinking through, like organizational structure, institutional missions, actually try to kind of reconfigure the nature of the program through collaborations with artists, and actually try to work with artists in a way that other organizations weren't, or couldn't, or wouldn't, or shouldn't, and actually turn the place on its head, and actually sort of start with discussions with artists, in dialogue with artists, and trying very hard to make artworks. It was probably one of the most famous, which I didn't make but produced and then showed, was the famous Jeff Koons puppy at Rockefeller Center. And one of the things we started to do, instead of starting with a site, a budget, and a notion of where, was actually start working with artists and thinking through their practice, thinking about New York City, thinking about the potential of where their work might fit within the shape of the city. And so one of the earliest projects was with Rachel Whiteread, a British artist who at the time had just done a project called House and was being widely berated in the British press for it, when we invited her to New York and started kind of investigating the city. And one of the kind of great romantic icons of the city, certainly after Burnt and Hill of Besher, and their photographs are the water towers of New York. And we also wanted a piece. We were sort of thinking about public art as a kind of, this sort of omnipresent object in the city, and how we might kind of be able to get away from that. How could you actually, I think it was Ad Reinhardt said that sculpture is the thing you bump into backing away from a painting. And that's, I think that says a lot about public art. So we're trying to think of like a work that could be present at certain times and invisible at others. And that's why we ultimately did this project, which was called Water Tower, which is this translucent resin water tower on the roof of a Soho building at Grand and West Broadway. And here you can see, in fact, here it's disappeared against the skyline. And at the time, it was also, it wasn't just a sculpture. It's not about making a physical thing, sitting and taking up space. It's also about, thinking about these works in context, in time, in place. And at that moment, the galleries and the art world was really migrating to Chelsea at a great pace. And I think it was Roberta Smith who said with this piece, it was kind of like a snake that was shedding its skin. We're also like thinking not about, the issues at that time was that, a lot of public art was really quite timid and appropriate and community organized and integrated into art and architecture, and had gone through a kind of veritable selection process and had kind of ticked all these different boxes, but still remained somewhat eviscerated. And so, we kind of thought, let's actually take on the city. New York City is a very theatrical town, And I think, to some degree, we may have kind of overdone it and become kind of over-spectacular and be kind of, like, basically probably culpable in terms of the aggrandizement of art. This is a work by Takashi Murakami at Rockefeller Center. Pipilotti Wrist. And actually sort of say, like, actually, art, rather than it being kind of, art and architecture where art is subservient to the architecture or integrated in the architecture, actually take on the architecture of the city and use the physicality of the city. This is a piece by Pipilotti Wrist at that time in Times Square, where in fact, rather than using the screen as something that one looks into, which in the case of the Panasonic board in Times Square would be quite pathetic anyway, actually use this as a kind of screen which Pipilotti is kind of looking out of, and rather than like using this so-called speed of Times Square, slowing the whole process down, so the works always have a kind of certain level of incongruity. In that space, there's Tony Ausler, a piece called The Influence Machine in Madison Square Park. William Kentridge, who many of you must know, South African artist who made a beautiful series of films called 9 films, which trace the journey of a rather middle-aged man within the landscape of apartheid South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa. So in this case, films that one could quite easily show within a gallery. They have a very beautiful soundtrack, so we commissioned a South African orchestra to play the works live within the context of Prospect Park. A beautiful voice of the female singer, and join this together with a concert of Hugh Masekela, the activist and South African jazz musician. And then I think this is finally with the Public Art Fund. Oh, no, not quite. Trying to think about, can you make public art that is really not public at all? But how do we actually take this thing of, the process of research, production, exhibition, and archive seriously, and be engaged in all the processes? So Pierre Huyghe is a French artist. He wanted to go to Antarctica in search of an albino penguin, a voyage that we had to kind of work through and organize. We would then make a film of that, document this process, this kind of impossible journey. The piece was called The Journey That Wasn't. Find the albino penguin, and then recreate, there's the albino penguin, and then recreate the journey as an orchestral event on the ice rink of Central Park, using the city as the kind of landscape. So transforming it to this, with a live performance in which the audience is also a participant in a film that then is ultimately shown at the Whitney Biennial and becomes the final piece of Pierre Huyghe. And then by the end of my time at the Public Art Fund, I think I was just trying to provoke people and taunting people in New York. And this is a piece called Daddy's Big Head by Paul McCarthy, 40-foot inflatable at the ice rink in... It seemed like suddenly I was doing a lot of artwork in ice rinks for some reason. The ice rink in Harlem. And finally, Franz West. when we kind of like, this was the kind of first major show of France in New York. You probably know him now. And I think we kind of sort of moving towards the scatological. And then I moved to the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, and which was going through a transition. And it was going through a transition because it had sort of had its first decade. It was founded by Marie-Louise Hessel. After, at the advice of a number of academics, curators, and artists, that she had a fairly sizable collection, somewhat idiosyncratic collection, quite personal, and yet also at a scale that was beyond the domestic, certainly, and trying to consider what to do with that. And as we're at an art fair, this is a question that is burnished on everyone's mind at present. This huge accumulation, both of private wealth and the accumulation of artworks as tangible assets. No, but this was in the 90s, and she was advised that actually the collection itself could form the basis of a school called the Center for Curatorial Studies. And over the years, the collection had become, in a way, it was, it's like all assets, like a car. Is a car an asset or a liability? Like, which column do you put that in? Well, and how do you keep it running? Or do you buy a new car? And I think over the years, certainly through the 90s, it was like the sort of law of diminishing returns. Somehow, like the collection itself became less and less visible within the practice of the students. Now, also, you want students who react against the so-called imposition of a collection. But a collection is always something one has to kind of, work with. And it was part of the remit of the center. And I think Marlies very generously said, look, I kind of understand that. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll build a building that will be the Marie-Louise Hessel Galleries. And that will house, on a more or less semi-permanent basis, the works from the collection. And so there was a plan to build this annex next to the CCS. On the right, you can see the old CCS, the school, the library, and two quite large Kunsthalle spaces. And on the left, the new building, which the architect said was inspired by Palladio and Hudson Valley Industrial. So we decided to put it. So my first move was to say, look, it's not going to work. It's not going to work to have a semi-permanent exhibition space of the Marie-Louise Hessel Galleries. Why? Why? Well, because, one, no one would come. Or they come once and they leave, and they never come back. The other is the nature of the collection is not one of masterpieces. There are some real masterful works. There are some works that might even come close to that category, but the interest of the collection isn't that. Is it a institutional collection? No. But there are many institutional collections which also have their own idiosyncrasies. For example, the Whitney seems to have an astonishing number of American Surrealist paintings. Well, so the question becomes, what do you do with those idiosyncrasies? How do you play with a collection of almost 2,000 works within an institution that is really asking questions around the curatorial, about presentation models, working with students, and also being a school that also has a museum that's also looking out to the public as well, that has to have a public profile. So we decided to call it the Hessel Museum, because that's what it is. It also forms the basis of then behaving in certain museum-style ways. Like you start to think about the space and the collection in ways that were previously unconceived of. We also think Bard, for any of you, maybe hopefully there are a few people here who might consider coming to Bard or telling their children to come to Bard. We also, it's in quite an isolated place. We often go through this misconception that Bard is just north of New York City. Well, it's not, and it's very deeply in the Hudson Valley countryside, which is very beautiful. And we live on this very rural, very idyllic park setting, and we commissioned Oliver Eliasson to make this work the Parliament of Reality. A number of works. What it means is that the students being in this like quite rural environment in a park-like setting it means it's a very, very intensive environment to be in. As a young person who thought they were going to New York City, but actually find themselves there, trapped for 2 years. So what it means is you have this kind of incredible kind of possibility for research. And what we did was we put a huge amount of effort into really expanding our library and our archive facilities to really provide this as a research facility. And we're currently engaged in thinking about how that great expansion of that part of the program can be affected now by the expansion of the collection. Library. So the collection itself. Mary Louise, I don't think she'd mind me telling you, she used to be rather embarrassed about this, but she was Miss Germany in the early 60s, and which kind of, I think, has quite an important impact on what she collected in some ways, later probably in life. She lived in Munich, and she used to go to Heine Friedrich Gallery. And if you don't know Heine Friedrich was a great champion of conceptual and minimal practices. Many of the great American artists of our time really made their practice, like Donald Judd and others, made their practice with the support of Heine Friedrich, which ultimately led to the evolution of Marfa, Texas, Donald Judd's compound, and the Deer Center, also in upstate New York, just a little bit nearer to New York than us. And she couldn't afford Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, Roy Lichtenstein, and others. So she managed to buy very, very cheaply Gerhard Richter, Blinky Palermo, Immick Noble, and others. In fact, she took this piece here. This is part of these. Can't really see. These are these large white paintings. She took this home under her arm in Munich, and her husband said, well, what are you doing with that ironing board? Yeah? And I think what's kind of interesting with Marlies, she was buying these works, but she wasn't actually putting them up in the house. Like we're in the context of an art fair, so you normally buy, like most collectors I know start out by buying works, putting them in their house, realizing they're not quite as good as they want, so they get new works, then those go back in the house, and they become display items, which also speak to sophistication, social class, certain community. This wasn't the case with Marlies, and she moved. Mr. Hessel, strangely enough, had a bicycle factory in Mexico City when everybody in Mexico rode on bicycles. And so they moved to Mexico City, where there was, I think at that time in the early 70s, there was always a fear of revolution. So it wasn't a great place to store all your artwork. So the artwork kind of remained stored in Europe and in the United States. So I think there's always this kind of like, this sort of distance between the works and the collector, which then played out later in an institutional setting. So she started with the German artists, moved on to Arte Povera, Cornelis, Gilberto Osorio, who sadly has been somewhat forgotten. Then she was a collector also who didn't really work with artists. She worked with galleries. And that becomes quite important in terms of the trajectory of looking at this collection historically. And so, I shouldn't say this, but the galleries can lead you astray quite often. And she worked very closely with a great gallerist that's called Holly Solomon. We have a rather large collection of so-called pattern and decoration from the 80s, whose time has still not come to revisit, perhaps. But she collected Cindy Sherman very early on, and I think what had happened to some degree, collections become characterized very easily in the public sphere, and I think a lot of people characterized Marlies' collection through Cindy Sherman, for whom we have an almost historic trajectory of her work, to Mapplethorpe, who we have one of the largest private collections of Robert Mapplethorpe, including the infamous X portfolio, and Rosemary Trockel. And then one of the ideas with the museum was, I think, like Marlies said, look, I just want this to be a document of our time. and maybe it's time to stop collecting, you know? And we'll stop sort of the end of the 20th century. To which, it's very interesting, we said, why would you do that? Right, why would you do that? This is the actual thing, the actual passion you have, you know? And actually, we want to continue collecting. We have an enthusiasm for collecting. We don't want to kind of like freeze this in a time frame and in a box, or like it's rather like kind of locking yourself up in a pyramid, you know. And then people wait 40 years and come and steal everything. So we continue to collect Trockle in depth, Cathiope, Andrew Zittel, and Alan McCollum. And so then we were starting to think, okay, well, how do we, you know, so the first show, the kind of inaugural show, I did a show called Wrestle with a colleague called Trevor Smith, where I really wanted to say, okay, let's like, this is kind of quite interesting that we have this actually very sexualized collection that I don't think quite deals with identity, but certainly deals with the politics of the body, the politics of the self, transgressions, dressing up, acting out, and because we don't have a collection that goes from A to Z or 1960 to 2012, you know, you kind of go along and then there's a gap. There are kind of, and then there's some really excellent works from a period, but then there's another big gap. So you can't do the kind of standard museum historical trajectory of contemporary art. So starting to think about how one mixes that up, or do we actually make a virtue out of these sort of lacunas in the collection, or do we make a virtue of the idiosyncrasies, both of what we have and where we are? And I think one of the things, like, you know, one of the things when you're working with a collection, you have to say, you have to make a virtue out of your greatest vice. No? And our greatest vice is, but nobody comes to the museum because it's so far away. So they come at so there's a very limited audience. You know, we're not on 14th Street. And so I think that actually presents us, rather than with problems, presents us with a lot of opportunities. So we could be fairly explicit in this. We could bring out material from Maplethorpe that no museum on Main Street would show. And I'm going to skip through this. And then there was this idea that the museum would only house works from the Hessel collection and no other works, which is a challenge, you know. And you know, what I've done in my practice, say through like with the public art, and one of the things I've always tried to do and tried to think through is actually discuss these issues with artists and think through the possibilities of this with artists. Now, artists give you enormous permission. So I invited Martin Creed to co-curate a show with me at the beginning. We did a show called Feelings. My daughter used to say, "I've got feelings too, Dad." But when she saw this, she said to Martin, "No hard feelings." This was a piece called Half the Air of Any Given Space. So the first thing to do in a museum is actually, instead of welcoming people, shut them out, force them to actually engage with, you know, make the museum an unpleasant experience. No? And so filling the entrance with these balloons immediately looked very, very enticing and playful and amusing and colorful and a kind of joyful, kind of easy work, but in fact is a trap. As soon as you get into these balloons, you're then thrust into darkness and really have to fight your way through to get into the show. Here, half the space of a given wall, a wall work by Martin with a painting by April Gopnik. One cactus larger than another. Sorry, it's not zipping. Sorry about this. Just be one moment. Okay. Nope. I don't have a lot to say about this work. No. Oh. No. And one, no. And one tree larger than the other. So one of the things we've actually tried to do with the exhibitions is actually, actually look at what we have within the collection and actually how we want to make an exhibition, and then add works to the collection, really for the exhibitions themselves. This again was Martin's show. Here, one of the largest works, Donald Judd on the smallest wall, and the smallest work, Kim McConnell, on the largest wall. And also, museums are very quiet places, or they are certainly at Bard anyway. So we had a piece called Running, where every 6 minutes the guard would run through the whole museum. And here you can see a work by, this is kind of mise-en-scène, kind of almost a kind of diorama presentation. A work by Martin with a piano, basically, the lid rises until it rises to the full point and then bangs shut. It's almost like being in a domestic set, a little Andy Warhol box there. You can see a peach box, and then this very weird Eric Fischl painting with a boy playing with his penis in a bath with a African-American maid, which is really strange. And then we said, okay, let's take the notion of making exhibitions seriously, like as kind of like, what are the possibilities of making exhibitions with this work? So what are the kind of tropes of exhibition making? Well, one is the solo show, Cindy Sherman. One is the thematic show, Lexicon, with Alan Ruppersberg and Jenny Holtz and others. One is the historical show. So we can't do from 1960 to 2012, so we did 1982. And what's quite interesting, I think Ferdinand de Saussure, who drew a diachronic axis and a synchronic axis in linguistics, both a vertical and a horizontal. If you take a slice of time, 1982, you actually see that there are very different kinds of practices going on at one time. Robert Mangold doesn't suddenly stop making paintings. Louise Bourgeois is still being photographed by Robert Mapplethorpe. And of course, our Carl Andre, Intersex, was also made in 1982. Then we started to investigate, okay, well, how could we function as a truly educational environment that's also an asset to the school itself, to Bard itself. And we have a series of curators in residence. We invited Anna Paula Cohen from Latin America, and she did an exhibition called Living Under the Same Roof, where we really spent an intensive 3 months investigating the physical nature, the historical nature, the use value of the collection, inviting artists, students, faculty members as a constant educational sphere. So turning the whole museum over to the school, building a library within the school, thinking about how archival materials can also be made available both within the school environment and for the public itself. How can the public actually literally get its hands on precious material? And then really inviting the public, students, undergrads, graduates, faculty members. Turned out to be one of the most expensive projects I've ever done. And simply cheap. The other way in which we've worked, with Rachel Harrison, a similar kind of strategy to working with Martin Creed. Solo show of Rachel Harrison. Here again, a kind of exhibition. This exhibition, for example, would be impossible within the confines of the Museum of Modern Art, the New Museum, the Whitney, given the sheer numbers of people that go through museums today, or the kind of popularity of museum exhibitions today. We organized in the CCS College the Rachel Harrison solo show based around all her installations, and in the Hessel then juxtaposing works both from Rachel, here we see Pink Stool, with other works in the collection. So here the kind of obtuseness, the obdurate nature of this figure on the Pink Stool is met by a little Nam June Paik there, a suit by Scott Burton, and this rather strange Philip Guston painting. And for, collaboration with Franz West, a wig on his sculpture. And then we also, as part of the show, we called it And Other Essays. We invited other artists, colleagues of ours, to curate their own work within the context of the collection. So here's a series of rooms organized by Andrea Zittel, where she picks up on, I think artists are fabulous curators, actually. And also they're very generous. They actually live within communities, so they often pull information out or allow you to see works that no curator would kind of dare make claims for. So, you know, here we have like a classic Rosemary Trockel, this torso, this kind of almost androgynous. It's more like male-female than androgynous. Torso with the knitted bottoms. And then on the wall over here, Joe Zucker. I doubt any museum would put a Joe Zucker, Rosemary Trockel, and an Andrea Zittel together. Bob Morris, Kusama, Andrea Zittel, and Kiki Smith. Tom Burr actually made the work. This was a piece called For Thomas. We have an incredible array of photographs by Robert Mapplethorpe of a man called Thomas, who happens to be one of the best endowed figures in the collection. And Tom Burr was kind of astonished as a young man growing up and discovering his sexuality, absolutely astonished to find these photographs of Thomas by Robert Mapplethorpe, and that we had them in the collection. So, and also, you know, Tom's partner passed away of HIV/AIDS, and he has a personal connection to the history of this work and to this community. And so he made this work, which picks up more on somewhat on the social context of the photographs, but actually more so on the formal aspects of Mapplethorpe's work. Nayland Blake, we did a work called the Nayland Blake's Hessel collection. Where Nayland, we gave him all the names of all the works in the collection. He Google imaged them and then ran them through in sequence. So you had all the Hessel works referenced by Google images. And then Nayland has the most incredible record collection. So we put Nayland's record collection in the gallery. So that was being played by a rather famous New York DJ at various times. And then we had DJ classes. And in a way, kind of playing this joke, this game between curating, DJing. We've reinstalled, represented historical exhibitions. This was one from the 90s called Too Much Joy, which was pattern and decoration. Arte Povera exhibition that Marl East organized in 1992. Then we were organizing a Blinky Palermo exhibition and trying to think of, you know, how we might recreate or restage. In some ways, Blinky Palermo made a number of ephemeral painted works in houses and in domestic spaces in Germany. And so as part of this first US survey, we were thinking, how might we kind of represent what was really quite important work at its time. And so we thought, I worked with Josiah McElhaney and Lynn Cook on this exhibition, where we said, let's actually think about domesticating the museum. And actually, kind of all of us, we have the kind of like this sort of great privilege to sit in collectors' homes and I don't smoke in front of Agnes Martin, you know. And I thought it was kind of interesting. I started looking at homes, and you know, like baseboards are kind of important, you know, like the white paint that you have in homes is not the white paint you have in galleries. So very, very subtly, just adding certain elements, putting a cornice round the doorway. Suddenly, this modernist building suddenly brings the whole thing down. And then we introduced. You know, I'd gone to Judge Martha, and he had this kind of fantastic furniture by R.M. Schindler, where he used to actually look at his own work and some paintings by Tony Smith. So he remade this rather lavish, beautiful R.M. Schindler furniture, and then recreated the living room of Marie-Louise Hessel, not in a kind of fetishistic way, but in a way that one can actually, you know, what's kind of interesting in homes is you also get very idiosyncratic juxtapositions of work. Glenn Ligon, Louise Bourgeois, Agnes Martin. And that's Blinky Palermo. a bedroom. This was a kind of classic bed by the designer Paul Evans in mirrored surfaces, the Gerhard Richter, with the André Zittel dress. A wonderful little piece by Rosemary Trockel. It's just a little tape measure that women use to measure the hemline on their dress. Back to the Eric Fischl. This is with Kiesler's furniture that was designed for the Art of the Century show in 1950, the Guggenheim, with the Moskowitz, the Fischl again. Briefly, because I know I've been, I'll also go a little quicker on these. I then thought, like, we bought this piece by Liam Gillick. It was created for this wall piece called Odrodak Wall. I thought it'd be kind of interesting. Most obdurate and incomprehensible work probably in our collection. It was part of the early days of relational aesthetics, historic piece, large historical piece. I thought it was kind of interesting to make a show just to explicate the one piece, to kind of invert the whole process. And also the possibility of the show, because it's relational in the sense that it demands others to finish the work, was the kind of perfect way in which we could work with our students, because they had to ultimately, literally, ping and pong the work back between Liam, the institution, and the public. Chaim Steinbeck, this is my current show, thinking about like recreating installation that he did at Artist Space in 1979, but now within the context of the Hessel collection. Chaim, you'll know, very famous American artist. You probably know his shelf work. Everybody knows the shelves of Chaim Steinbeck. So the strategy was, how do we do a retrospective of Chaim Steinbeck with only 2 shelves? So this was to really look at the historical material and the Chaim Steinbeck that people don't actually know. But I think one of the things that was important with Chaim was he's an artist, and with all the artists we work with in the context of the Center for Curatorial Studies, is to actually think about artists who are thinking about exhibition making and presentation, how artwork is presented, consumed, distributed, circulated, discussed within exhibition practices. And so Chaim had done a number of works, these large-scale installations within in Europe, but never done so in the United States. So this was an opportunity for us to kind of really profile, I think, probably the more interesting side of Chaim Steinbeck. And also we started thinking about the whole museum as a kind of storage. It's a grand storage facility, essentially. And how do you make that storage how do you make that more accessible? We're not alone. There are many institutions thinking this through. This is one piece called Display. It goes all the way along this long gallery in which we show work by Chaim. There's a wonderful store in Hudson in upstate New York that Nancy Shaver runs, where she has these wonderful objects. So we asked Nancy to contribute objects from her store. It's called Henry, and our multiples and smaller works from the collection. And the show is called Once Again, the World is Flat. So this idea of like actual equality between objects. In the back of this, another display mechanism using scaffolding, bringing out, so essentially creating a kind of storage area in the back, bang in the center of the museum. Here with work was like some quite famous work, Alan McCollum, Katie Noland, and then work that's completely forgotten. There's Lois Lane painting. That's actually a terrific painting. And at the bottom we had kind of works from the collection. On the top we had all the artists who kind of haunted Chaim: Sola Witt, Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, and then sort of pointing out this kind of above all these great figures of American art, that the time of the 70s, artists like Chaim and others in the East Village, John O'Hare and many others, were actually trying to figure their way out of. And I'm going to just this is the show. So now I can say that in fact we didn't. This is a show curated by Julia 2 years ago. At the CCS as part of her graduate project with performance artists and works from the collection, including Yusi Kusama, 2 artists primarily, A.K. Burns and MPA, who are kind of part of a Williamsburg collective, or were certainly at the time, Louise Bourgeois and other works, and including this work which they kind of destroyed by Carl André, but of course it wasn't the Carl André, it was a recreation of the Carl André. And this is this, and in fact, this is the kind of, I don't know, death of the phallus or something. And then finally, I just wanted to, I think because I've probably gone on a little bit too long, I'm doing a project with some of these characters up top: Liam Gillick, Rick Tiravanija, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Philippe Perreno, and Pierre Huyghe, who are colleagues on a project we're working on right now to think about the role of the school in an international context and how we kind of how we find a level of connectivity with what else is happening in the world, and also allows us to start thinking about the school itself also as a place not only of research but of production, of exhibition, presentation, and then archive. And to allow our graduate students, our master students, to have opportunities that allow them to take on post-degree projects, which maybe are not degree-run projects, but actually possibilities to maintain a collaborative relationship with the center. So we're working in Arles in the south of France with the Luma Foundation, and Arles is famous for well, a few things: Van Gogh, absinthe, Romans, and the Alice Combs church, and now it's becoming famous for the Luma Foundation. And anyway, there's this. We don't have a home yet, so we chose to work in the Roman amphitheater, and we wanted to do a show. You know, the museums have become incredibly conservative with their kind of pre-planning, the marketing budgets, advertising, development departments, all this kind of enormous infrastructure, which actually one sometimes wonders whether they're actually there for the creation of art or the restriction of art. So we decided to do a project where we'd invite a number of artists, colleagues like Pierre Huyghe, others, and also a younger generation who we don't know so well, and also an older generation like Lawrence Weiner and Daniel Buren. And we needed a kind of exhibition. What did you say? A kind of exhibition structure. We said, well, let's take over the Roman amphitheater. We need an exhibition structure. Let's do, and this was conceived by Philippe Perreno and Liam Gillick. They said, well, what we're kind of doing is doing a giant sand pit. So why don't we kind of fill the amphitheater with sand? And we'll start as a beachscape, and over the period of 3 or 4 days, we'll turn it into a moonscape. And so constantly throughout the exhibition, this was a constantly evolving 24-hour process of the sand shifting into the moonscape. The theatre was open to the public. There was no advertising. There was no schedule. Rick Tiravanija, but the theme was via the beach to the moon. So Rick Tiravanija had a spaceman walking throughout the amphitheatre with a harmonica inside his spacesuit. Here he is walking among little flags planted by Daniel Buren. Pierre Huyghe, we released, each day we would release 20,000 bees. And followed this performance. Oscar Murillo would organize yoga classes. This was very, very popular. This was very popular too, actually. Elvire Bondel did casting classes. Sylvie Renaud did made umbrellas. Henri Salah, they would play songs from the beach to the moon. Any song that had the beach in it or the moon had it, they would play across the amphitheater. Dominic Gonzalez Forster created an opera, recreated the opera Peer Gynt one evening, and no camp is complete without the campfire. And we lit the bonfire with Douglas Gordon at the end. And so I think in this case, what we were starting to do with 20, 30 artists, starting to create a kind of environment, sort of experimental environment that was probably more like a school than it was an exhibition. That's me. Thank you. So, are there any questions? Yeah.
Please wait for the microphone
And we have 2 mics in the audience, and we'll pass it to you to take your questions. So we'll start here.
What was the audience participation in the stadium?
Sorry, where is the person who said that? Oh yeah, no. Zero actually. It was just people who came to the. It was people who came to see the Roman arena. So it actually had a rather large attendance because it's summer in the south of France. So actually, and I thought it was kind of amazing that people paid their tickets to come to the Roman arena. They'd suddenly find a man with bees on his head walking into the sand, and people would stay. People were intrigued, and so people would come back the next day and the next day, and it's quite interesting where these things take on word of mouth, and then people started to work with us, and then we, over the period of a week, it became quite infamous. People who found it extremely frustrating, say, were the Tate International Council, saying, well, what time is the Pierre Huyghe? And I'd say, well, I don't know what time it is. Because actually, it's not for you. It's not for you, and we're not making art for this kind of art circus. No, there's a good circus, and I think it plays a role, and I think those places and that kind of mode of operation plays a very significant role. It's important, no doubt, but that doesn't have to be the orthodoxy, and also the thing is, it's a school, so we don't know what the outcome is. What are you doing tomorrow? I don't know. It's a school, And also it's a school in the sense, more an art school is a different mode of pedagogy. It's a different way of thinking about education. Like Liam Gillick, he's a faculty member at Bard, which has a very rigid sort of, very disciplined, here we're going to do this. Liam came on, he said to the students, he was teaching a course. He said, your task is go run in the woods, document it, and come back. And no one took him seriously, so he failed the whole class. And I think that's fantastic. Fantastic, we need sort of more of that, And this was kind of that. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us what was happening in that picture with the puppets and the people dancing.
The piece is very beautiful. It's by Rikrit Tiravanija, and it's called "Shall We Dance." Rikrit is of Thai origin, so the king and I, is a kind of reference point. And it was a piece, and so you put the record on and you just dance. But the piece was made for a show, I believe, in Art in General in New York in the early 90s. It was a show reflecting on the AIDS crisis. So there's this kind of wonderful tenderness to the whole piece too. And then the piece on what happened in the puppets. That group of artists and curators were constantly being asked to do talks, and they could never get to the same place at the same time. So Philippe Perreno and Rikrit created these puppets of themselves, so they could always go with the puppet. So it could be Liam talking with the puppet, or Hans with the puppet, and yeah.
That's extraordinary. And it occurred to me in looking at the slides you showed that at one point there was a Baldessari came up. Baldessari taught at Cal Arts. Eric was a student there at one point. When you raise the word pedagogy, something extraordinary is happening at Bard clearly. I'm not sure it happened at Cal Arts. Was it that their model of both pedagogy and what they wanted to try and do as both teachers who were engaging students different? I mean, you weren't there, but you know the history, I suspect. I'm astonished to see what you pulled off here.
Thank you.
It seems different from what was happening at another experimental school. Now, Bard may not regard itself that way. Certainly Cal Arts did. Do you have any reflections on the transition in pedagogical models between what might have been happening at Cal Arts and what you're doing here?
No, but I do. Well, I do, but I don't. I think, clearly what happens is that programs become institutionalized. It's quite interesting. Hans-Ulrich Obrist always says, institutions are so interesting before they're built. you know? And like Mönchengladbach is a kind of good example of that in some ways. And so I think institutions, whatever they are, whether they're schools, not-for-profits, they constantly need. I think after every decade they need revitalizing. You know, they fossilize so easily. They are in fact themselves a form of fossilization. So I'm a strong believer in fire the director, you know. So my time's kind of up, you know, like on this one. But you know, so I think that happens a lot. I think people, you know, I think it's a very natural kind of process. And the higher up administrations, particularly in colleges, in pedagogical structures, can become real strictures, you know, like nobody bothered. Like, it's quite funny, you can get away with things when no one's looking at you, and then you become really visible, and then suddenly you represent something, you know. Like, I thought it was kind of interesting with the Public Art Fund. I thought we did great projects under Giuliani, because Giuliani really wasn't just disliked us, was openly antagonistic to us. You know, so it was a game of cat and mouse in a way. Well, quite big cats, big mice, you know. But so with the Bloomberg administration, where you've got someone who's a real supporter of the arts, it's actually paradoxically more difficult because you're being embraced, and so what you're doing somehow represents something else which you never really wanted to represent. You know, like, so suddenly, Paul McCarthy, daddy's big head, inflatable patriarch with a big nose, there's a carrot on a ketchup bottle, suddenly represents the beneficence of the city government. And I think that becomes a problem. I think, like for us at Bard, we have a structure. What's interesting is the graduate programs are really quite semi-autonomous or autonomous of the college. Like, we have a Conservatory of Music, an Environmental Studies program, a Human Rights program. The college is primarily undergrad, so the graduate programs have a level of flexibility. And it's also the ethos of Bard and the president, Leon Botstein. You know, we kind of try to do things that others don't. Like we have a graduate program in prisons in the Hudson Valley. You know, which, you know, for example. Yeah. No more?
Any last questions?
One last one.
You mentioned, you just quickly described some tropes for exhibitions, like the group exhibition, thematic, lexicon type thing. Do you have any ideas about tropes of methodologies for curating?
Well, I do. There's actually a course at Bard College, which is a 2-year course. I don't have any
Can
kind
you
of
summarize in point
No,
form?
I don't think I have. I mean, I have my own methodologies. I think, like, what's kind of interesting today is the fact that the curatorial is really very, very broad. Sometimes misused. A friend of mine said, I'm curating apartments. The other day to me, and he said, "I love curating. I'm curating apartments." And there's a danger of this kind of spread, so that the curating actually becomes meaningless. So I think, like, it's very important with curating to not always be sure, but to be precise. You know, and I think, like, that's very important. So you're always curating in time and space. Even the internet is a space. And it's a time, you know? And so I think that kind of, be precise, I guess is the short of it.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for your inspiring talk. It was a pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all.